It was late and well past midnight, and I was starving. After a long day of unpacking boxes in my new apartment, I had no energy to cook, so I ordered food from a 24-hour delivery place I'd never tried before. The app showed the delivery driver was close by, but after 15 minutes, there was still no sign of him. I started to get impatient. I was about to call when my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Almost there. See you soon. A shiver ran down my spine. The message was strange, too casual, almost personal. But I shook it off, assuming it was just the driver being friendly. 5 minutes later, there was a knock at the door. I glanced through the peephole but couldn't see anyone clearly. The light outside was dim, and the figure on the other side seemed to be shifting, leaning in close to the door. When I opened it, a tall, thin man with messy hair stood there, holding a small brown bag. He was staring at me with an intensity that made me want to shrink back inside. But hunger won out. I thanked him quickly, reaching for the bag, but he didn't let go. Instead, he just held it, staring down at me, his pale face expressionless. After a moment of awkward silence, he finally spoke. "You're new around here, right?" Yeah. "Just moved in," I replied, forcing a polite smile. His eyes gleamed, and he leaned in closer. "It's not very safe here at night. I'd keep an eye on who's watching you." Unnerved, I took a step back, letting go of the bag. His hand slipped from it slowly, his fingers brushing mine, lingering a bit too long. Then, without another word, he turned and walked off into the darkness. I watched him until he disappeared around the corner, my heart racing. Once inside, I set the bag on the counter and took a deep breath, trying to shake off the encounter. I was being paranoid, I told myself. But when I opened the bag, a wave of nausea hit me. There was no food inside, just a crumpled piece of paper. I unfolded it and saw a message scrawled in smeared ink. "You're not alone. Someone's inside." My heart skipped a beat. I quickly checked my door. It was locked. I knew I hadn't let anyone in. But the message was so specific, so deliberate. I felt ridiculous, but I had to check. Armed with my phone flashlight, I crept through each room, turning on lights and peeking into closets. My mind was racing, my pulse thundering in my ears. Every shadow seemed to shift. Every corner held the potential for someone hiding. But the apartment was empty. Just as I was beginning to calm down, my phone buzzed with another message. It was from the same unknown number. "You shouldn't have opened the door." This time, panic truly set in. I called the restaurant, hoping to get answers, but the person who answered seemed confused. They told me that they didn't have any drivers out for delivery past midnight, especially to my neighborhood. They assured me that I must have ordered from somewhere else and hung up. I stared at the phone, dread pooling in my stomach. Another message buzzed in. "Check the closet." At this point, I felt like I was losing my mind. I'd already checked the closet, hadn't I? But something compelled me to look again. With shaking hands, I made my way back to the bedroom closet and pulled it open. Empty. But when I turned back around, my stomach dropped. The delivery driver, the same man who had handed me the bag, was standing right there in my bedroom doorway, his face twisted into a mocking smile. "Did you think I'd just leave?" he whispered, stepping closer, his eyes glinting with something dark and unreadable. I backed up until I hit the wall, fumbling for my phone, but he reached out and grabbed my wrist, squeezing tight enough that I dropped it. I struggled, trying to pull away, but his grip was like iron. "Shoo!" he whispered, bringing his face closer to mine. I could feel his hot breath against my cheek as he leaned in. "I told you, it's not safe here at night." Before I could scream, his hand clamped over my mouth, and he leaned even closer, his voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't check under the bed, did you?" With a sick smile, he let go and backed away, disappearing into the darkness of the hallway as I crumpled to the floor, gasping for breath. I waited for what felt like hours, paralyzed, until I finally got the courage to get up. My hands shaking, I turned on every light, checking under the bed, the closet, even the crawl space. No one was there. Finally, I called the police. They arrived quickly, searching the apartment, but they found no trace of the man. When I described him, the officer's face grew grim. He told me that the description matched that of a man who'd been breaking into homes around the neighborhood for months, posing as a delivery driver and watching new tenants until they were alone. Before they left, one of the officers handed me my phone, which had been left lying on the bedroom floor. I didn't even want to look at it, but when I finally did, I saw a photo taken from my camera, time-stamped around the time I'd been in the closet checking. It was a picture of me, standing there with him standing right behind me, his eyes locked onto the back of my head. I never ordered late-night delivery again. I just turned 17 working for a local pizza place. It was the usual routine, answering calls, grabbing the pizza, and driving out to the customer's place. I didn't mind the job even if the tips were hit or miss. But every once in a while, I'd get a delivery that felt strange. One night, right before my shift ended, we got an order from way out in the sticks. It was already pushing midnight, and normally we didn't deliver that far, especially at night. But business had been slow, and my boss insisted I take it. The address wasn't showing up right on my GPS, so I called the number listed with the order. A woman answered on the other end, her voice soft but with this odd, echoing quality that made it hard to tell if she was close to the phone or speaking from far away. "You'll see it," she said. "Just drive to the end of the road and keep going." "Keep going?" I asked, feeling a chill creep up my spine. But she didn't elaborate, just told me to hurry. When I finally reached the end of the main road, there was nothing but trees and gravel stretching out before me, barely lit by my headlights. I considered just turning around, but I couldn't shake that voice in my head, soft and urgent, almost pleading. Against my better judgment, I kept driving, the road getting narrower and more overgrown. After about 10 minutes, the trees thinned out, and I saw a dimly lit house sitting by itself in a clearing, surrounded by woods on all sides. I pulled up to the house, grabbed the pizza, and walked up to the door, which was barely hanging onto its hinges. Before I could knock, it creaked open on its own. I couldn't see anyone inside, just dark, empty rooms beyond the entrance. The place looked old and abandoned, but somehow I could smell the faint scent of smoke or something burning. Hesitant, I called out, "Your pizza's here?" Silence. Then, from somewhere deep in the house, I heard the woman's voice again. "Come in. I'm in the back." Every instinct told me to get out of there, but I found myself stepping inside, my sneakers crunching against something on the floor. When I looked down, I saw shattered glass and what looked like burnt pages of a book scattered across the ground. As I moved further into the house, my footsteps echoed, and the air grew heavy, thick with the smell of burnt wood. I called out again, hoping I'd imagined the voice. Then I heard it, the faintest sound of breathing coming from a doorway at the end of the hall. My palms were slick with sweat as I gripped the pizza box tighter, telling myself I'd just leave it there and bolt. But as I reached the doorway, the breathing stopped, replaced by a soft, low chuckle. My heart was hammering, and I felt frozen, unable to move. I took a shaky breath, whispering, "Hello." A hand reached out from the darkness, pale and skeletal, with long fingers that wrapped around the doorframe. It was followed by a face, but not like any face I'd ever seen. The woman's skin looked stretched too tight, her eyes hollow and dark, her mouth curled in a strange, too-wide smile. "You brought me my pizza," she said, her voice soft and hissing. I could see every word coming from that open, twisted mouth, her teeth too sharp, too pointed. I couldn't move. I just stared as she tilted her head, looking at me with those sunken eyes. She leaned in closer, whispering, "You look like someone I know." With that, she grabbed the pizza box, her bony fingers brushing against mine, sending an icy shock through my skin. She brought the box up to her nose and inhaled deeply, a slow, deliberate breath, before she started to laugh. A low, hollow sound that made my whole body go cold. Then she just vanished, slipping back into the shadows as if she'd never been there at all. I stood there, stunned, staring at the empty doorway. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it, but nothing felt real anymore. I was about to leave when my phone buzzed. It was a message from the pizza place. My boss was furious, asking where I was, saying that the customer had called to complain I hadn't shown up. I looked back at the empty doorway, my mind reeling. Someone had called to complain that I hadn't delivered the pizza, but I'd just given it to her. Before I knew it, I was running out of that house, heart pounding, barely able to breathe. I jumped into my car and sped off, not stopping until I reached the main road. As I drove, my phone buzzed again. Another message from the restaurant. Don't go back to that house. You're not the first driver to go there, and the others never came back. My blood ran cold as I read the message, my mind flashing back to that hollow smile, the skeletal hand, the way she'd looked at me like I was familiar. I'll never know who or what that woman was. All I know is that I quit the job the next day and never looked back. But sometimes, at night, I still hear her laugh, echoing through my dreams. It was nearing 1 a.m., and I was exhausted. My last delivery of the night was to a house way out on the edge of town, a place I'd never been before. I'd been warned by coworkers that the late-night deliveries out there could be weird, but I didn't think much of it. Tips were tips, right? The road was winding and narrow, and my GPS signal kept dropping as I drove further out. Eventually, I saw the house come into view. A rundown, two-story place with chipped paint and broken shutters. The front yard was overgrown. The only sign of life, a flickering porch light. As I approached, I thought it was odd. No cars in the driveway, and the windows looked dark. I double-checked the address. This was definitely it. I grabbed the bag, walked up the creaking steps, and knocked. No answer. After a few moments, I knocked again, louder this time. From inside, I heard a shuffling sound, like footsteps dragging across the floor. The door slowly cracked open, revealing a narrow slice of the dark interior. I could barely make out a figure standing just out of sight. "Pizza delivery," I called out, my voice trembling a little. A frail, older woman appeared in the doorway, her face barely visible in the dim light. She was thin, with deep lines etched into her skin and eyes that seemed unfocused, distant. She stared at me for a long moment before finally speaking in a raspy whisper. "You brought food?" she asked, almost confused, as if she hadn't expected anyone to actually show up. Yes, a large pepperoni with extra cheese," I said, holding out the bag. Her bony fingers reached out, wrapping around the edge of the bag, but she didn't take it. Instead, she leaned in, close enough that I could see the dark circles under her eyes and smell a musty scent, like she'd been closed up inside for far too long. "Did you see him outside?" she whispered, glancing past me into the darkness. Her voice was trembling, and I could see her eyes darting around as though she was afraid of something just beyond the porch. "See who?" I asked, my skin prickling. Her face twisted, and she pulled me in closer, her grip surprisingly strong. "My husband. He's been trying to come back." Her words sent a chill down my spine. Before I could respond, I heard something, a low, dragging noise coming from around the side of the house. I froze, heart pounding, and the woman's grip tightened on my wrist. "He doesn't like visitors," she murmured, her voice barely audible. "But he's always so hungry." Suddenly, the dragging noise grew louder, like something heavy was being pulled closer, scraping against gravel and then wood. I couldn't see anything from where I was standing, but I could feel an intense presence, a sense of something watching me from just beyond the shadows. "Maybe I should go?" I stammered, trying to pull away, but her grip held firm. "No," she whispered sharply, her eyes wide with fear. "You can't leave yet. He'll follow you." Her voice was frantic, desperate. I managed to wrench my arm free and stumbled back down the steps, the bag still clutched in my hand. The woman's eyes followed me, hollow and dark as I backed toward my car, every instinct screaming at me to run. As I reached my car, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, a figure standing by the side of the house. It was a man, or at least something that resembled one. His body was bent at odd angles, clothes tattered, his eyes fixed on me with an unnatural hunger. I didn't wait to see more. I jumped into the car, heart pounding, and sped down the road, not daring to look back. My phone buzzed as I drove, and I glanced down to see a notification from the delivery app. Order canceled. Wrong address. My blood ran cold. I wasn't supposed to have delivered there at all. I don't know who or what I'd almost left that pizza with, but I quit the next day. I'll never forget that woman's face, her whispered warning, and the thing that watched me from the shadows. It was almost closing time when the call came in. I was the only driver left on shift, and honestly, I was ready to clock out. But my boss tossed me one last order, a small plain cheese pizza. The delivery address wasn't far, but something about the name on the receipt caught my eye. It was just an initial, L, followed by a blank space. Weird, but I shrugged it off and grabbed the pizza. The house wasn't hard to find, but it looked like no one had lived there for years. Paint was peeling off the wood, the windows were dark, and the porch light flickered weakly, casting unsettling shadows across the yard. I hesitated, checking the address again on my phone. It matched, so I took a deep breath and headed up to the front door, the pizza box tucked under my arm. I knocked and waited, feeling the night settle in around me. The silence was unnerving. Just as I was about to knock again, I heard faint footsteps from inside, slow and deliberate. The door opened just a crack, and a young girl peeked out. She looked about 12, with dark hair that fell over her face and wide, sunken eyes that stared up at me without blinking. "You're here for Elle?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded but didn't say a word. I held out the pizza, waiting for her to take it, but she just stared at it, then at me with a blank expression. It was unsettling, but I managed a small smile, trying to lighten the mood. "Here's your pizza. Cheese, right?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped back, motioning for me to come inside. I hesitated, glancing around. This wasn't normal and something felt wrong. I shook my head, holding the pizza out again. "I can just leave it here. It's late." The girl looked past me, her gaze drifting down the darkened street. Her eyes widened, and she grabbed my arm, yanking me inside so fast I barely had time to react. The door slammed shut behind me, and I felt a jolt of fear shoot through me. "What are you doing?" I asked, pulling my arm away. But the girl didn't answer. She just pointed to the window, her hand trembling. "He's coming," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Who's coming?" I asked, trying to keep calm even though my heart was racing. She looked up at me with terrified eyes. "The man who brings the others. He'll see you." I didn't know what she was talking about, but her fear was contagious. I could feel a chill in the air, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in a matter of seconds. I walked to the window, peeking out, and saw a dark figure standing at the end of the driveway, barely visible under the streetlight. He was tall, wearing a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. He didn't move, didn't come closer, just stood there watching the house. I turned to the girl. "Who is that?" I whispered. "He's the one who took them," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Mom, Dad, everyone else who came here. He takes them and then they never come back." My stomach dropped as her words sunk in. I backed away from the window, suddenly feeling trapped. "Listen," I said, "we need to leave. Do you have a phone? Can you call someone?" She shook her head. "No one answers anymore." I looked at her, seeing the exhaustion and fear etched into her face. Whatever was going on here, I knew I had to get out. I reached for the door, but just as I did, a loud knock echoed through the house, deep and rhythmic. Felt like it was rattling my bones, vibrating through the walls. The girl grabbed my arm again, her face pale with fear. "He's here. Don't open the door." But I couldn't just wait around. My hand reached for the doorknob, against my better judgment. As I touched it, I felt a cold, electric shock run up my arm, freezing me in place. The knocking grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from every direction. Pounding, relentless. I finally pulled my hand back, heart racing, and the knocking stopped. Everything fell silent. I turned to the girl, ready to ask what was happening, but she was gone. "Hello," I called out, but there was no answer. I looked around, but the room was empty. The pizza box lay on the floor where I dropped it, the cheese slowly congealing in the cold air. I backed toward the door, desperate to leave, and that's when I saw it. A shadow creeping under the doorframe, sliding slowly across the floor toward me. I bolted, throwing the door open and sprinting down the driveway. I didn't dare look back. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and sped off, not stopping until I reached the main road. When I finally glanced in my rearview mirror, the house was dark, empty. There was no sign of the girl, no sign of anyone. I returned to the pizza shop, pale and shaken. My boss took one look at me and asked what had happened, but I couldn't explain. I just handed over the receipt and left, determined to forget it all. But as I climbed into my car to go home, I noticed something that sent a new wave of fear through me. Scribbled in tiny letters on the back of the receipt, barely visible, were the words, "Thank you for coming. We were so hungry." It was my last delivery of the night, and I was ready to go home. My shift was supposed to end hours ago, but one order kept me out. A huge order from a house way off in the woods. According to the map, it was a lonely house near the edge of a forest just outside town. The directions were strange, too. After driving down a deserted back road, I'd have to take a winding dirt path, past several turns that weren't even on the map. I wasn't thrilled, but the tip promised was huge. I followed the directions, squinting to see in the darkness, my headlights illuminating nothing but trees on either side. After several turns, I reached a clearing with a single house in the middle, old and entirely dark, no porch lights, no windows lit up. The place looked deserted. I double-checked the address. This was definitely it. With a sigh, I grabbed the boxes of food and walked up the steps. I knocked, but there was no answer. My stomach tightened as I waited, listening to the silence stretch on. Then, from somewhere deep inside the house, I heard a noise, a faint shuffling, like footsteps slowly approaching. I knocked again, louder this time. I didn't want to be rude, but the silence was so intense it was making my skin crawl. The footsteps stopped, and I heard a faint, scratchy voice call out from inside. "Just leave it on the doorstep." It was hard to tell, but the voice sounded wrong, like it was strained or struggling. I set the boxes down on the doorstep, but I had a nagging feeling that something was off. All right, your food's here," I called out, hoping to make this as quick as possible. Silence. As I turned to leave, I heard something else. Another voice, faint but unmistakable, calling out from deep within the house. "Hello? Is someone there?" The voice was shaky, desperate. I froze. The voice sounded different from the one I just heard. It sounded like someone younger, almost scared. Against my better judgment, I leaned in, pressing my ear to the door. "Hello," I called back softly, not sure who, if anyone, would respond. The voice came again, faint and trembling. "Help me, please. I'm in the basement." My heart raced. I looked around, wondering if this was some kind of prank, but I couldn't shake the chill running down my spine. "Are you okay?" I whispered, barely able to get the words out. The first voice, deeper, raspier, answered, cutting me off. "Leave. Now." My whole body went rigid. It felt like two people were standing on the other side of the door, each one trying to keep the other quiet. I backed away, a feeling of dread settling over me. I stepped off the porch, nearly tripping over the stairs. As I fumbled to steady myself, I heard a different sound, a faint tapping, coming from one of the dark windows. I glanced over, and for a split second, I saw a pale face staring out at me. The eyes were wide, desperate, but as soon as I blinked, the face was gone. My instincts screamed at me to get out of there, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was trapped inside. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking as I tried to explain what I'd seen. The operator assured me they'd send someone to check it out, and I waited in my car, my headlights fixed on the dark house. After what felt like forever, a squad car pulled up and 2 officers stepped out. They approached the house and I watched as they knocked, calling out to see if anyone would answer. The door creaked open and the officers disappeared inside. Minutes passed and my pulse hammered as I waited, gripping the steering wheel. Finally, one of the officers came back out, waving me over. I rolled down my window and he leaned in, his face pale. "The house is empty," he said, his voice low. "It's been vacant for years." Cold shock hit me. But I heard someone. There was someone inside. And the food, I delivered it. The officer's expression darkened, and he nodded slowly. "We saw the food, but there's no one in there, son. Just the basement door and a lot of old chains down there." I stared at him, speechless. The officer looked back at the house, then turned to me. "This isn't the first time we've been called here, you know? Locals say they hear voices, knocking, sometimes even screaming. No one lives here anymore. Not for a long time." I felt a wave of nausea, thinking about the desperate voice I'd heard, the pale face in the window. The officer patted my shoulder gently. "Get home, kid, and maybe think twice if you get called out here again." I didn't need to be told twice. I sped out of there, barely able to catch my breath. Even now, I still wonder about that night, and about the voices I heard echoing from inside that empty house. I never took another late-night delivery shift again.